takes time, right? I think that the bottom line of part of why collaboration is hard is because it's just human and based on trust at the most fundamental level. And so you can write whatever MOUs and have lawyers check whatever, but you've got to look in each other's eyes and trust each other. It is absolutely well-intentioned people with the same end goals, and yet such different notions of how to get there, or at least how they're talking about how to get there. And so especially as we move into this new phase, I don't know if it's a whole brave new world, but certainly in some ways a new phase of social impact with, investors. That's new, right? Just talking about grant makers as investors, much less actual investors who are sitting around waiting for returns. That's all really new and things that most nonprofits are probably not set up to deal with. And so how do you get that in-house?
When organizations and leaders talk about collaboration, it's like, well, we don't know who to collaborate with. So we can sit here and say, okay, well, we could hold matchmaking events. We could introduce them. We could do all of these things, some of which we've tried, and some of which, frankly, really aren't that welcome as a funder, to be that heavy-handed. And so I wonder about that. I wonder what that's about. I wonder if that's really about you don't know who you should partner with, or if that's really about that cultural, getting back to that cultural piece. And I do think that there's an important role that funders all stakeholders can play, again, in normalizing it, lessening the burden on these leaders, to sort of maybe in a non-directive, didactic way, but kind of creating situations or collaborations or partnerships that might work.
Even though we're all working towards the same goals, we're all sort of accountable to different entities. So when I think about it from our perspective of the federal government, we're held accountable to, the White House and federal regulations and Congress and the Office of Management and Budget, and making sure that we get appropriations for the following year. And then I think our grant makers are accountable to their board members and the nonprofits that they're working with and serving, and the beneficiaries being served, and then the nonprofits are focused on the beneficiaries being served. And so even though we're all trying to work on the same goal, because we have those different sort of entities of accountability, sometimes they seem in conflict with each other.
In order to succeed in the kind of co-funding and collaboration that we do, we have to foster and maintain strong relationships. And we have to do this with our grantees, with our co-investors, within our own organization. When we started doing this, we had a whole new set of customers that we didn't have before. We had, these really well-known foundations and individual funders and some corporate funders alongside of us that we had to pay attention to. So I think one of the most important things that we realized early on is that someone has to be in charge of that. Someone has to pay attention to that. Someone has to recognize that these are important relationships, stay on top of them, foster them, help find out what's motivating these people, help find out what's the easiest, how do they want to engage, what's their interest level, all of those things that the people trying to get grants from us already know and already knew how to do. So that was something that we had to learn how to do.
I just think about communication. With our program, there's a ton of federal regulations that have to be adhered to. And so sometimes it can feel very compliance heavy. And so I think something that stands out about our program is our relationships with our grantees, and as program officers, we're extremely hands-on. So we'll have, if it's a newer grantee, weekly check-ins. If it's a more experienced grantee, maybe monthly. But in terms of those check-in calls and communication, it's really understanding who the grantee is, what their successes are, what their challenges are, and really understanding their perspectives. So the regulations and compliance pieces aren't just coming down so heavy-handed, but they're more informed. And so I think that communication piece is definitely key.
Really honest communication and recognizing your needs communication, right? Which, especially in the nonprofit world, in very deep contrast to the business world, in a lot of ways at least, there is that positioning and that pleasing the funder and that culture of like dressing up and looking right to get the next check or to get a bigger check or, you know, whatever else. And it's toxic. It's so damaging for everybody because then you end up serving 22 different funders trying to make what you do look like 22 different things. And it's the worst because, again, in most cases, the funders want the same outcome that you do and are not horrible people. But there is that lack of willingness or courage or ability to clarify and speak your needs in a real way in the nonprofit sector. There's a whole gender theory there that we could talk about on another panel, but it's a really big problem that there isn't the culture or habit of nonprofits being able to identify what they need and say that really loudly and strongly and put the right price tag on it, right? Either because of shyness or scarcity mentality or the lack of talent in-house to just budget it accurately.
I think one of the ways that you can get people really more deeply engaged in this work is to do what you were talking about, which is find out what do they bring to the table. Everyone has something to teach. Everyone has something to learn. So find out what do you want to get out of this? You know, what can you give to this? And then help slot people in those opportunities. We know our grantees already either have an evaluation that has been done or they're in the middle of an evaluation about the effectiveness of their program, kind of what Keisha was saying. So we know we will get their program impact at some point along the way. When we sort of look at the success of our funding strategy, it's pretty simple. Did you increase the number of youth served? And by how much? Did you increase the amount of reliable, renewable revenue that you have? You know, whatever your identified business model or revenue strategy is, are you making progress towards that? Have you increased your evidence, your organizational capacity? And then for the co-investors themselves, our funding partners, were we able to raise the funds? Are they satisfied? We do a bunch of different sort of qualitative surveys and conversations around that. And then I think most importantly, do they reinvest? Do they say that was really successful? We'll do another round of growth capital with you. It is not what the grantee spent the money on. Like, doesn't matter. I mean, it matters maybe from an intellectual standpoint about like, what do you need to spend money on to be successful as a nonprofit? But as a funder, I don't care. Like, I want to know what impact you're having on your kids or on the environment or whatever it is that you're doing. If you want to keep your partners or your collaborators engaged, get off short-term accountability and move to longer-term strategy and impact.
It's like any sort of relationship that you enter into that will by definition be kind of messy and ill-defined despite best efforts and best thinking. You need to be able to trust each other's experience, reputation, leadership. So that's just number one. Also, shared commitment to goals. So that's it's just like a slightly different take on what Zia and some of the other panelists have been talking about. I mean, it's important to make sure, I've seen several collaborations start and fail because the partners didn't pay enough attention to how the collective goals of the collaboration may or may not contradict or challenge the goals of the organization or their own personal goals or whatever broader political situation. So it's, again, it's sort of something that like, yeah, it's sort of obvious, but you really have to look explicitly at, okay, what happens if this collaboration is successful? Will I be able to prioritize, or to make it successful, will I be able to prioritize pushing towards these goals, or might I be sort of conflicted with my organization or my broader situation and not actually really want to see it succeed? And that happens way more often than you would think. So you really have to play that out. And then lastly is inclusive participation. So we haven't really talked a lot about that explicitly today, but every community, has people and organizations that are, active and doing work on important issues. You go to community meetings, you see these folks, but you know who they are and you partner with them, and they're an incredibly important part of your outreach work. But there are also folks that, that you don't see, that you don't know, that aren't plugged into the foundation, grant-making sort of community that you're not connected to. And I think having those people involved is actually the most important thing. Going out in different ways than you usually do. Don't issue an RFP. This is something we did for Collaborate Boston. Try creating posters and go to community centers and health centers and housing developments and hang them up and invite people in. I think having those, what we call unusual suspects, involved in partnerships and collaboration, make them richer and make them more successful.